Hello, I hope you're well, welcome, or welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be my August reading wrap-up. August was a big month for me as far as reading goes because I was taking part in 2 reading challenges. Women in Translation Month. The second challenge that I took part in was the History Challenge, readathon, hosted by Emma at A Cup of Books, Jenny at Bookish Shenanigans, and the 2 Justins at Triumphal Reads and Ghost Readers. I was trying to read nonfiction history books and check off 16 prompts. There will also be 2 books that had absolutely nothing to do with either of these challenges as well. With that rambly introduction, let's get started. The first book I want to talk about is Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. I read this book and simultaneously listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Akwaeke Emezi, the author. What I appreciated about the fact that I listened to the audiobook was that it really made me slow my pace down. There's so much happening and the language is so rich and so beautiful that I think if I read it at my normal reading pace, I would have missed a lot. As I find with a lot of literary fiction, there can be some vagueness. There's a lot of ways to interpret what's actually happening. That's how I felt with this book as well. The story is about Ada and the Obanji. The best way I can describe them is as spirits or gods or something of that kind of otherworldly sort. They are really the guiding force, these protectors, the subconscious of Ada. These Obanji are in control in a lot of ways. You get the sense that for a large part of the book, Ada is the puppet and they're kind of pulling the strings. They're the ones who really narrate most of the book. It was just really interesting to see the way this Igbo culture was layered onto this story. It's not like anything I've ever read before. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was absolutely stunning. Loved the exposure to this Igbo culture and the Obanji. Would definitely recommend. The next book I want to talk about is The Queen's Fortune, the story of the Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Essentially, the story of her marrying into the Habsburg family. She goes to Austria because her sister is betrothed to the Emperor Franz Joseph, and what ends up happening is that she and Franz Joseph accidentally fall in love with each other, which is why the book is called The Accidental Empress. But I did have my quibbles with this book. 2 of them are rather nitpicky. So there are multiple points in this book where Cece, before her marriage, is referred to as Duchess Cece or Duchess Elizabeth. And she's not a duchess. Her father is the Duke, which means that her mother would have the title Duchess. But also, Duchess isn't used in the same way you would use Mrs. or Mr. or something like that. It just felt a little bit lazy. The other was that they refer to Budapest. My problem is Budapest wasn't unified at the time that this book was taking place. The city of Budapest was actually 3 smaller cities of Pest, Buda, and I think the other one was Uda, and it wasn't unified until like 1873. So again, just felt like lazy fact-checking and editing. The last quibble was more about the actual experience of reading the book. I didn't necessarily like the conflict that arose in the marriage. Like, it felt a little jarring. Then I also could see where the story was going and could predict it. So in the end, I gave this book 3 stars. My quibbles, though, really kind of brought the overall reading experience down for me. The next book I'm going to talk about is the first book that I read for Women in Translation Month, The Besieged City by Clarice Lispector. I've heard so much about Clarice Lispector, who for many is considered the greatest Brazilian author of the 20th century. The plot itself was fairly simplistic. It's about this young girl, Lucrezia, who wants to get married. She does end up marrying and moves to a big city from her kind of backwater town of São, I believe is the name of the city. Eventually she does return home, but by the time she's returned home, São is nothing like she remembers it. This backwater town has been industrialized and modernized. This was a struggle for me. I could appreciate that the language was really out of this world. Like, there's nothing to compare it with. It was striking and unique, except that I had no idea what was actually going on. At the back of the book, they do have what looks like it was a review from someone in 1949, and they describe this book as a grueling novel to read, that it requires tremendous effort to get through, and that having finished it, we don't feel the effort is worth it. While it is very, very harsh, it is also very, very accurate and made me feel somewhat validated in my feelings towards the book. So I gave this book 2 stars. I just don't know what to take from it. Like, I couldn't understand it at all. Serious confusion and mental fatigue. Another book that I read for Wit Month was Sweet Francaise by Irene Nemirovsky. So Irene Nemirovsky was a Jewish woman living in France during the occupation. So this was written during that time. She is unfortunately deported to Auschwitz, where she dies. So this is actually an unfinished novel. It's the first part of what Irene planned to be a 4 or 5 part novel. So the first part is a series of vignettes of different people in occupied France fleeing the Nazis as this occupation is about to begin. It's interesting because it really is following kind of the everyday, mundane aspects of life, just in this extraordinary circumstance. Part 2 is something entirely different. It is during the German occupation and really focuses on Madame Angele and her daughter-in-law, Lucille, in the town of Bussy. Madame Angele and Lucille are billeting this German officer named Bruno. Meanwhile, their son and husband is a German POW. So, tension, to say the least. But again, this was interesting because a lot of what's happening is really about daily life. It feels rather humanizing in a way. This idea of the conquered and the conqueror not actually being all that different. It was such an authentic look at the French occupation through this fictional lens. I absolutely loved it. I did give it 4 stars. The reason being is that technically this is a first draft and not a complete novel, but if Irene Nemirovsky had been able to complete this in its entirety and had been able to edit and revise, this would be like 10 stars easily. It's kind of mind-blowing to me that this could be someone's first draft of something. So the last book that I read for Wit Month is The Door by Magda Szabo. This is essentially the story of these 2 women. There is Empress, who is this illiterate workhorse of a woman who won't let anyone into her home, who is hired by this character, Magda. It is about this relationship between these 2 women. Empress is kind of a curmudgeon, but a lovable one, if there is such a thing. She picks battles with Magda all the time over some really bizarre things. This is one of these books where you know how it ends, essentially. By page 3, you know that Empress dies and you know that Magda blames herself. What you don't know is how Empress has died or why Magda blames herself. You're reading this book slowly trying to piece together the details, the chain of events that lead to that conclusion. This book had so much imagery of doors and this idea of being closed off, whether it was secrets people were keeping or this communism or an actual door being bolted against something. It was unsettling. I gave it a 5 stars because of that. I need to read her other books, of which there are several. The next set of books that I'll be talking about are for the History Challenge. And the first book I'm going to talk about is Severed, A History of Heads Lost and Heads Found by Francis Larson. This book lived up to my wildest, most morbid dreams. Essentially, it is a book about the different types of decapitated heads. This book is not for the faint of heart. It can be a little graphic at times. Each chapter is essentially focused on a subsection of this idea of disembodied head. Chapters that I've found really interesting. There was this one on shrunken heads. Yes, you do actually learn how shrunken heads are made, but you also learn about how colonization and this othering kind of proliferated shrunken heads and created this market for them, which then caused something that was part of these non-Western cultures to become more capitalist than part of any sort of tribal ritual. And the other chapter that I also found interesting was this one on potent heads, which talked about saints and their heads as relics and also sort of the medicinal qualities that had been attributed to like the blood of the decapitated people. I gave it 4 stars because the last chapter, which was on like cryopreservation and then also the conclusion, just didn't feel as compelling or as interesting to me as the rest of the book had. So the next book I read for the History Challenge was Too Much, How Victorian Constraints Still Bind Women Today by Rachel Vorona Cote. So the book is really a look at the Victorian era through the lens of its literature and how that lets you understand the culture's depiction and understanding of women being too much. I thought this would be really interesting because Victorian literature is what I studied as part of my English degree, so I thought this would be really up my alley. It was, to a degree. The book is broken up into these unique chapters, like there's one on self-harm, which I knew nothing about in relation to Victorian society or literature. The physical body, so weight, hair, and skin color, and all of that. Chapters on sexuality and sex and being too outspoken, and just, it was broken up in an interesting way. But I did have some issues with the book overall. I didn't feel that anything that Vorona Cote said in this book was particularly revelatory or new. A lot of what she was talking about are well established as part of the study of Victorian literature. So it's not that she's necessarily adding anything to the discussion. If anything, she's reinforcing already accepted interpretations of these works. In her defense, she is taking it a little further because she is bringing it into the modern day context. She mentions Nicki Minaj and Cardi B and Britney Spears circa the early 2000s when she shaved her head, Lindsay Lohan. My other quibble though was that I felt a little bit like this was a memoir masquerading as like a study of Victorian literature. And I wasn't expecting that. It felt a little gratuitous to me. I would have much rather it have just remained a history or a study of literature. Because of that, I gave it 2.5 stars, rounded it up to 3 on Goodreads. The next book is A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of the American Spy Who Helped Win World War II by Sonia Purnell. It was amazing. It is a biography, but it reads more like a page-turner of a novel. Like, this whole episode in history is just amazing. It's better than any James Bond or spy movie because it's real life. Virginia Hall, who this book is about, is just this badass woman that I'm just like, how has there not been a movie about her? How is she not more known about? And then I remember, she's a woman. That's why. This is a biography on Virginia Hall, who is an amputee who goes on to build this network, the French resistance network and basically plays an integral part in ensuring that D-Day is a success and that the French resistance is effective. What she does is just insane. I mean, she climbs a mountain with her prosthetic leg. She stays in the field for longer than anyone. She then goes back knowing that it's certain death, a very painful death at that, if they find her. And she still goes back to France knowing that to be a radio operator, which is one of the most dangerous things you could do. My mind was just blown the entire time. It is 5 freaking stars, and I'm sorry if you hear my neighbor's dog barking in the background. The next book is one that I literally finished this morning, The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste, with this stunning cover. It's about World War II, but it's set in Ethiopia during Mussolini's invasion in, I think, 1935, and it's really focused on the women warriors. The main character is this young girl, Harut, who is a soldier, and also, to a lesser extent, her officer, Aster. And what I found really interesting is that this book really does focus on these women in Ethiopia who aren't just tending to the wounded and the dead. These are women who are actually soldiers. These are women who are making bullets and who are collecting guns and all of this stuff. They are on the front lines with the men. Although it is historical fiction, probably leans more towards being literary than your typical commercial historical fiction. I did give this 5 stars. I will say that there are these sections called photo, which are descriptions of photographs that this character, who's Italian, who's also a photographer, presumably has taken, an interlude that I didn't actually feel the need for. I felt like they kind of took you out of the actual stories themselves. But yeah, I did give this 5 stars despite that, because I really enjoyed it. It is a longer book. It is over 400 pages long. I am going to recommend it to you all and to everyone who's looking for something a little bit different in the historical fiction genre. The last book is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which I am still reading at the time that I'm filming this. I'm listening to it as an audiobook primarily. I wanted to add this because I'm about 70-ish% through according to the audiobook. I don't have a ton to say about this because I obviously haven't finished it yet, but I am thoroughly enjoying the experience of reading this. It is a female-centric retelling of Homer's The Iliad. It's really focused on the women of the Trojan War and their experiences, and primarily these are the women who are held captive after their cities have fallen. It's about these women whose lives have drastically changed, and they now have to come to terms with their new lives, whether they are common slaves, whether they are trophies who are used sexually, whether they are widows or grieving mothers or what have you. And it's really looking at the war through the lens of these women. The main character is really Briseis, whose name I feel like I'm not pronouncing correctly, who is just absolutely mesmerizing. The writing has been stunning. There's this one scene that is probably no more than a paragraph, maybe 2, on this opal necklace that literally had me tearing up in the middle of the night when I was listening to it. It's just so beautiful. So, with all of that in mind, I'm going to predict that this is going to be 5 stars. I feel like it would have to really go downhill for it to be anything less than a 5-star. So yeah, on that, I have covered all the books that I read for the month of August. It was a really good reading month. I had a ton of fun taking part in Wit Month and also the History Challenge and discovering other booktubers who read nonfiction like me. Thank you so much for watching. If you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please leave a comment and subscribe. I will see you on my next video. Take care, everyone. Bye!